The day Abigail Keller rode into Dusthaven, New Mexico, with nothing but a carpetbag, a loaded derringer, and the kind of quiet fury that only comes from burying a husband too soon, every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and stared. Every man, that is, except Homer Vaughn, who was leaning against the post outside the livery with his hat pulled low, and his eyes aimed somewhere past the horizon, like he was looking at a country that no longer existed. It was the autumn of 1873, and Dusthaven was the sort of town that had grown up fast the way weeds do, sprawling and graceless but alive, fed by the cattle drives that funneled north along the Pecos River, and by the silver rumor that kept bringing men west with their dreams packed tight in their saddlebags. The main street was called Main Street because nobody had bothered to give it a fancier name. There was a general store owned by a man named Percival Oakes, who was always behind the counter and always suspicious. There was a saloon called the Dusty Boot that served whiskey strong enough to clean a wound and beer that tasted like it had been cleaned in one. There was a small church without a permanent minister, a post office that doubled as the telegraph office, and at the far end of the street, tucked between the blacksmith and the edge of the open desert, there was a boarding house that a widow woman named Mrs. Clara Hewitt ran with iron discipline and surprisingly good biscuits. Abigail Keller pulled her rented horse up in front of Mrs. Hewitt's boarding house, climbed down from the saddle with the practiced ease of a woman who had grown up on an Ohio farm and spent 5 years on a cattle ranch in Texas, and she stood in the dusty street with her carpetbag in hand and looked at the front door of the boarding house like it was a dare she intended to take. She was 26 years old. She had brown hair the color of good saddle leather, worn in a knot at the back of her neck because she had given up on anything more elaborate a year ago when life stopped giving her time for it. Her eyes were a particular shade of gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and they were the kind of eyes that saw things plainly and said so. Her husband, Thomas Keller, had died 8 months ago of a fever that came fast and left no room for argument, and it had taken her 6 of those months just to settle his debts and sell the Texas ranch at a price that was insulting but necessary. And the remaining 2 months she had spent deciding where a woman alone goes when she has skills and stubbornness but no family left to speak of. She had a talent for figures, which she had used to keep the ranch's books, and she had a reputation in the small town near the Texas ranch for being the woman you went to when you needed a letter written beautifully or a dispute resolved fairly. She had heard through a correspondence with an old friend that Dusthaven's only schoolteacher had left for California, and that the town council had been advertising the position for 4 months with no takers. A woman alone in 1873 had limited options, and Abigail Keller had always preferred to find the door that was open and walk through it without apology. She had not expected the position to come with the boarding house directly next to the livery stable. She had not expected the livery stable to employ a man who sat outside it like a stone formation, immovable and weather-beaten, with a hat that seemed fused to his head. But that was the first day, and she had more immediate concerns. Mrs. Clara Hewitt turned out to be exactly the kind of woman Abigail could respect on sight. 60 years old, built solid, with gray hair and no patience for nonsense, but genuine warmth underneath it all for people she decided were worth the trouble. She showed Abigail to a room on the 2nd floor with a window that faced west and a view that would have been beautiful in any other light, but in the late afternoon sun was absolutely devastating. All that red and gold desert rolling out to mountains the color of bruised plums. "You are the new schoolteacher," Mrs. Hewitt said. It was not a question. "I am," Abigail said. The last one lasted 4 months before the Colburn boys drove him back to civilization. Mrs. Hewitt set a pitcher of water on the washstand with the authority of someone issuing a warning. He was a young man from the East who believed children were naturally inclined toward improvement. "I grew up with 4 brothers," Abigail said. "I have no such illusions." Mrs. Hewitt looked at her steadily for a moment, and then something in the older woman's face shifted, opened just slightly, like a shutter coming ajar. "Supper is at 6. You sit at the table whether you are hungry or not. Those are the rules of this house." "Yes, ma'am," Abigail said, and she meant it without resentment. She had supper that first night with 3 other boarders. A land surveyor named Edmund Cross, who was polite and forgettable. A young Mexican man named Louis Reyes, who worked at the Silver Assay office and spoke careful English with a dignity that suggested he was aware of exactly how precarious his welcome in the town was. And the man from the livery stable, Homer Vaughn, who came in from outside and sat at the far end of the table without a word of greeting, with his hat still on his head. Abigail noticed the hat immediately. Every man she had ever known took his hat off indoors. It was as basic as removing muddy boots at the door. But Homer Vaughn settled into his chair at Clara Hewitt's supper table with his dark hat, a battered, wide-brimmed cattleman's hat, the kind that had been through genuine weather, pulled low on his head, and he reached for the bread basket without ceremony and without explanation. Clara Hewitt said nothing about it. Edmund Cross said nothing. Louis Reyes said nothing. Which meant, Abigail understood, that this was a standing situation, something established and agreed upon in the wordless way that communities accommodate men they have decided to accommodate. She studied him across the table with the same openness she brought to most things. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps a bit more. It was genuinely hard to say because his face had been arranged by outdoor living, and whatever else into something that placed him outside ordinary estimation. He had dark brown hair that curled slightly at the edges where it came out from under the hat, and a jaw set with the kind of permanent tension that comes not from anger, but from long practice at keeping things contained. His hands on the table were large and scarred, and entirely still when he was not using them, which Abigail found unusual because most men she had known fidgeted. He had gray eyes, she noted when he glanced up briefly in her direction, not the warm gray of overcast sky but the cold, still gray of deep water. He did not introduce himself. Clara Hewitt did it for him briefly, the way you name a landmark. Homer Vaughn. He works the livery next door. Homer Vaughn looked at Abigail for exactly 2 seconds with those still gray eyes and then looked back at his plate. "Abigail Keller," she said anyway, because she had been raised to speak her own name in her own voice. "New schoolteacher." He nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, and that was the entirety of their first conversation. She thought about the hat that night, lying in the bed with the window open to let in the desert air that smelled of sage and distance. It was an odd thing to fix on, she knew. The man was clearly private, clearly carrying something heavy, and the hat was just a hat. And yet there was something deliberate about it, something that was not carelessness or rudeness but the opposite, a very careful, very conscious choice made every day and every evening and apparently at every meal. She let it go. She had a schoolhouse to open in the morning and children to meet, and a town to understand, and a man's hat was the least of her concerns. The schoolhouse sat at the north end of Dusthaven, a single-room building with a wood stove and 16 desks of varying heights, and a blackboard that had seen better decades. When Abigail walked in on that first morning with a length of chalk and a head full of intentions, she found 14 children ranging in age from 6 to 14 waiting for her, which was more than she had expected and suggested that whatever Dusthaven lacked in refinements, the parents valued education, or at least believed in it enough to send their children. The Colburn boys were there as promised, 2 of them, Jed and Randall, aged 12 and 13, broad-shouldered and bored in the way of boys who have been told all their lives that book learning is for people who cannot work the land. They sat in the back and looked at her with the measuring look of people who have run off the previous occupant and expect to run off this one too. Abigail looked at them with complete calm, took the roll and said, "Jed Colburn, tell me the capital of this territory." Jed blinked. "Santa Fe." "Correct, Randall Colburn. What is the square root of 144? Randall's mouth opened and closed. He did not know. Nobody had ever asked him anything like that in a classroom before, or if they had, the teacher had moved on quickly to avoid the embarrassment. 12, Abigail said. By the end of this week, you will know that answer and a dozen like it, and you will not think it beneath you because mathematics does not care about pride. It only cares about whether you know it or you do not. She held Randall's gaze pleasantly until he looked away first. Open your primers, everyone. By the end of the first day, she had established something. Not mastery, not yet, but the clear suggestion that mastery was coming, which was sometimes more useful. She walked back to the boarding house in the late afternoon, and Homer Vaughn was in the stable yard next door, brushing down a bay horse with the long, steady strokes of a man who understood animals in the cellular way, the way you understand things you have loved for a long time. He did not look up when she passed. She did not try to speak to him. But she noticed that he worked past sundown, and that the horses in his stable were the best-kept animals in the whole town, and that the stable itself was clean in the fastidious way of someone who had decided that whatever else the world was, the space he was responsible for was going to be kept right. The weeks that followed settled into rhythm. Abigail taught her school, and in the evenings she worked on lesson plans by lamplight at the small desk in her room, or she sat on the front porch of the boarding house and read, or she talked with Clara Hewitt over tea, because Clara Hewitt turned out to be a woman of considerable intelligence and experience who had come to New Mexico in 1858 with a husband who had died of cholera in 1861, and who had built her boarding house from the ground up with her own savings and her own hands and a stubbornness she wore like armor. Abigail and Louis Reyes developed a quiet friendship. Louis was 23, a careful and thoughtful young man who had been born in Santa Fe and educated by Jesuit priests, and who was entirely aware that his position in Dusthaven required him to be twice as competent and half as visible as any Anglo man in the same job. They spoke sometimes in the evenings about the injustices that ran through the territory like a bad seam through otherwise good rock. The way the land-grant laws had stripped Mexican families of property they had held for generations, the way the law bent depending on who was standing in front of it. Abigail listened without the slightly uncomfortable politeness that some people brought to such conversations. She had seen enough of her own small injustices to understand that the architecture of unfairness was not abstract. Homer Vaughn ate supper every evening at Clara's table with his hat on, and he was not unfriendly. He was simply quiet in a way that filled more space than noise would have. When he did speak, which was not often, it was direct and complete, the speech of a man who chose words the way he chose tools, for purpose. He asked Edmund Cross once about the survey of the northern pasture land, and they had a 20-minute technical discussion that revealed Homer Vaughn had a thorough knowledge of land and elevation. He told Clara Hewitt once that the back step of the boarding house was rotting, and he would fix it Saturday morning if she wanted, and she said yes, and he fixed it on Saturday morning and did not accept payment. He told Louis Reyes once, simply and without ceremony, that the new Asser in the next county was known to falsify weights, and Louis should be careful, and Louis thanked him with a gravity that suggested he understood that information had real value and had been given freely. Abigail watched all of this. She was a person who paid attention, and she found Homer Vaughn interesting in the way that deep, still water is interesting not because it was performing anything, but because you kept wondering what was at the bottom. The hat was a constant. It was there at breakfast, at supper, when he was working in the stable, when he walked to the general store on Saturday mornings, when he sat on the front porch in the evenings sometimes with a cup of coffee. She had never seen him without it. The other boarders and Clara Hewitt moved around this fact the way you move around a piece of furniture that has always been where it is, not ignoring it exactly, but not commenting either. She learned from Clara on a Tuesday evening when the two of them were alone in the kitchen after supper some of what she had been piecing together. He came here in '69, Clara said, rolling out pie crust with the steady pressure of long practice. Came from Missouri. He was in the war Union side cavalry. He does not speak about it, and I have never asked, and I would encourage you to follow my example. I haven't asked, Abigail said. You have been wondering, though. Clara looked at her with the calm shrewdness of a woman who has housed many people and learned to read them. You are a wonderer, Mrs. Keller. You look at things until you understand them. Is that a criticism? No, Clara said. It is an observation. Homer Vaughn is a good man. He has been kind to me and to my boarders and to those horses next door without reservation or complaint for 4 years. Whatever he carries from the war, he carries it without burdening others with the weight of it. I respect that. Abigail was quiet for a moment. So do I, she said, and she found that she meant it genuinely. October settled on Dusthaven and brought the cool that the desert nights always carried, even after warm days. Abigail's school was beginning to cohere into something she was proud of. The Colburn boys had stopped disrupting and started competing with each other over mathematics problems, which was not an improvement she had entirely planned but was happy to use. A little girl named Rose Morales, 7 years old and sharp as cut glass, had taken to reading with the fervor of someone who has discovered that the written word is a door that opens onto everything. And Abigail stayed late some afternoons to read with her, because Rose's mother worked at the laundry until dark, and there was no one at home to listen. It was on one of those late October evenings, walking back from the schoolhouse in the near dark with a stack of papers under her arm, that Abigail found herself in trouble. The trouble came in the form of 3 men outside the Dusty Boot Saloon who had been drinking since midday and who had the kind of loose, expansive cruelty that whiskey sometimes produces in men who are already inclined toward it. They were not Dusthaven men. She had learned the town's faces well enough by now to know that, and they had the look of men between jobs, which in 1873 in New Mexico territory often meant men between legal occupations and illegal ones. The tallest of the 3 stepped off the saloon porch directly into her path. "Evening, schoolteacher," he said, and his voice had the overly affable quality of a man who thinks that friendliness is more frightening when you can see the edge behind it. "Good evening," Abigail said, and she stepped to the right to go around him. He moved to the right too, blocking her. She looked at him with the direct, flat gaze she had used on difficult situations before. Her hand moved toward the small pocket in her coat where the derringer was. "No need for unpleasantness," the man said, and grinned. "Then step aside," she said. "I think we might walk together a while first." "That will not be happening." The voice came from behind her, and it was Homer Vaughn's voice, quiet and entirely without urgency, which somehow made it more authoritative than shouting would have been. He came up alongside her from the direction of the livery stable, and he did not reach for anything. His hands were loose at his sides, but he placed himself between Abigail and the 3 men with the absolute ease of a man who has been in enough genuinely dangerous situations that this one registered as manageable. "Vaughn," the tall man said, and the grin did not move but something behind it shifted. So they knew him, Abigail noted, and they were recalibrating. "Go inside and have another drink," Homer Vaughn said, still in that quiet voice. "Or go to your horses and keep riding. Those are the 2 choices I am offering." There was a moment, a long one, the kind that takes place in the air between people when actual decisions are being made. The tall man looked at Homer Vaughn with the calculation of a man measuring risk, and whatever he found in the measurement, it was enough. He stepped back. His 2 companions stepped back. The tall man turned and went back up the steps into the saloon, and the other 2 drifted after him. Homer Vaughn watched until all 3 were inside, and then he turned to Abigail. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She was steadier than she had expected to be. "Thank you." He nodded. The same economy of motion she had already learned was characteristic. He turned to go back to the stable. "Homer," she said, and using his first name surprised both of them a little. She could see it in the slight pause before he turned. "Who were they?" "Rouse brothers," he said. They come through every few months. They are not as dangerous as they want to be believed, but they are dangerous enough to avoid. Have they caused trouble here before? Once. He paused, and then he added something she had not expected. I will let Sheriff Beale know they are in town. He should be aware. That is thoughtful, she said. He looked at her with those still gray eyes in the falling dark, and she had the sense again of depth, of something far below the surface that was present even though it was not visible. Walk back to the boarding house now, Mrs. Keller, he said, not unkindly. It is getting dark. She did, but she thought about him all the way there and over supper and lying in bed that night with the desert wind moving the curtains. The following Saturday morning, Abigail was sitting on the front porch of the boarding house grading arithmetic papers when Homer Vaughn came out of the stable and sat on the low fence of the stable yard, the way he sometimes did in the early morning when the light was good and the town was still quiet. He had a cup of coffee, and he was looking at the mountains, which were doing their morning thing with the sunrise, turning colors that had no real names. She had been thinking for a week about what Clara had told her, and about the hat, and she had made a decision that was probably unnecessary and possibly intrusive, but that her nature did not allow her to avoid. I wanted to thank you properly for Monday evening, she called across the few yards between them. Not just in the moment, he looked at her. It did not require more than the moment. I disagree, she said. The moment was one thing. The deliberate intention behind it was another. You could have stayed in the stable. He was quiet for a beat. I saw them when they went out on the porch. I knew you were coming up the street. So he had been watching for her. She filed that away without examination for now. Still, she said, thank you. He dipped his head in a way that was more than a nod and less than a bow, and it struck her as a gesture from another world, an older courtesy. You were in the cavalry, she said, and immediately she wondered if she had overstepped. He looked at her steadily, but he did not pull back. Clara told you. She said you came from Missouri and that you served. Nothing beyond that. Then that is all there is to tell, he said. She could have left it there, and she considered it. But there was something about the hat, something about the way he sat on that fence with the coffee cup, and the mountains behind him, and the weight of something she could not name sitting around him like weather. She was a woman who cared about people, genuinely cared, not in the managing way but in the plain way of someone who finds other people's inner lives genuinely compelling and worth attention. Did you have a home to go back to? She asked. After the war. The question was quiet, and she asked it with gentleness, the way you might ask someone if a wound still hurt, not to cause pain, but because ignoring it seemed crueler. Homer Vaughn looked at his coffee cup for a moment, and then back at the mountains. My family was in Missouri, my father and younger brother. He stopped. Then, after a measured breath, they were dead before I mustered out. Farm fire, 1864. He said it with the flatness of something that has been said enough times to lose its sharp edges but not its weight. There was nothing to go back to. I am sorry, Abigail said, and she meant it in the direct way she meant most things. He looked at her, and she saw something in those gray eyes that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. He was not accustomed, she understood, to condolences that were clean and immediate and not followed by something else. Some pivot to advice or silver lining, or the clattering attempt at comfort that people often use to manage their own discomfort with another person's grief. She did not say anything else. She went back to her arithmetic papers. After a moment she heard him set the coffee cup down, and she heard him say quietly, Mrs. Keller. She looked up. Your first week, he said. The Colburn boys, word around town is you handled them without flinching. She raised an eyebrow. Word gets around. In a town this size always. There was something at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the infrastructure of one. It was well done. She felt warmth in her chest, clean and uncomplicated. Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. Homer, he said, the same way she had used his first name in the street, with the slight pause of a man who did not give that permission lightly. Homer, she agreed. He went back to the stable. She went back to the arithmetic papers. But the morning felt different after that, lighter somehow, like something that had been held in a closed hand had been allowed to open just slightly. November came to Dusthaven with its particular dry cold, and the relationship between Abigail and Homer Vaughn developed in the way that real things develop, incrementally, organically, without anyone declaring that it was happening. He fixed a loose shutter on her window without being asked, and when she came home to find it done and thanked him, he said simply that he had heard it rattling, and it seemed like it was going to go at the next strong wind. She made him a pie apple and brown sugar, from the windfall apples Clara had put up in late October, and left it at the stable with a note that said only, "Shutter is appreciated." He ate the entire pie, and told her at supper that evening that it was the best apple pie he had eaten since Missouri. She started bringing him coffee on Saturday mornings when she came out to grade her papers. Just his cup, filled from Clara's kitchen, left on the fence post near where he sat. He accepted it without comment, but with a slight pause. The first time that she understood was gratitude finding its way out through a channel that was not used to carrying it. She learned him the way you learn a landscape you walk through daily, each feature revealed through repetition and attention. He had been 20 years old when he enlisted, which made him now 32. He had ridden with General Pleasanton's cavalry division, and he had been at Brandy Station, which she knew by reputation as one of the largest cavalry battles of the war, though he never said so directly. She pieced it together from small things, from a comment about Virginia red clay and a comment about the smell of black powder on a warm day. He loved horses with a completeness that was almost philosophical. He talked about horses the way other people talk about landscapes or music, with the vocabulary of someone for whom the subject is also a feeling. He read, which she had not initially expected, though it made sense to her once she discovered it. He read history mostly and geography, and once she saw him with a collection of Shakespeare's plays in his coat pocket, which she found delightful and said nothing about because she did not want to make him self-conscious. He learned her too. He knew her coffee preferences before she had told him directly, from watching Clara pour it. He knew that she worked late at the schoolhouse on Thursdays. He knew that she had a habit of rubbing the back of her neck with one hand when she was tired, which she did not know she did until he mentioned it once with a neutrality that nonetheless communicated that he had been paying attention. He learned because she told him one afternoon when they were both on the front porch in the blue hour before supper that she had grown up on a farm in Ohio, that she had wanted to be a teacher since she was 9 years old, that she had married Thomas Keller at 21 and loved him genuinely and grieved him genuinely and was not ashamed of either. "You speak of him without breaking," he said. "It took time," she said honestly, "but he would have been insulted if I made my whole life about mourning him. He was not that kind of man." Homer was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is a fortunate thing to have known someone like that." She looked at him carefully. "Have you not known someone like that?" He looked at the mountains, the way he always did when a question was larger than the expected channel. "I was 20 when the war started," he said. After that, there was not much room for fortunate things. She wanted to say something to that, something that was true and kind without being saccharine, but she found she did not have it immediately, so she was quiet, and found that being quiet next to Homer Vaughn was not a difficult thing but a comfortable one. He turned his head and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, open, not entirely guarded, something below the surface, closer to the surface than usual. "You are not like most people," he said. "How do you mean?" "You do not fill silence with noise to avoid it." She almost smiled. "Is that a compliment?" "It is an observation," he said, and now the infrastructure of the smile appeared again at the corner of his mouth. "Though yes." Clara Hewitt, who had been watching all of this from the kitchen window with the astute and largely unsentimental satisfaction of a woman who has seen enough of life to recognize when something good is happening, said nothing to either of them about it. She did, however, begin to arrange seating at the supper table so that Abigail and Homer sat not at opposite ends but near the middle, and she made this change so gradually over 2 weeks that neither of them noticed it consciously. Louis Ray's noticed. He mentioned it to Abigail one afternoon at the post office, with a quiet, pleased amusement, and Abigail said, "You are imagining things, Louis," and Louis said, "I am very good at my job, which requires precise measurement, and I am not imagining anything." December arrived. The first significant cold front came through, and Dusthaven wrapped itself in buffalo robes and wool coats, and the general determination of frontier people who have decided that winter is an inconvenience rather than a defeat. The school stove became the most important object in Abigail's daily life, and she recruited Randall Colburn, who had transformed, through some alchemy of challenge and genuine engagement, into her most reliable student in the upper years, to be responsible for its morning lighting. There was a Christmas social at the church on the second Saturday of December, organized by a committee of town women who approached the task with military seriousness. Dusthaven in 1873 had enough families that a real gathering was possible, and the church was strung with cedar boughs and candle lanterns, and someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had brought a lap dulcimer, and there was dancing, the lively kind that frontier communities did, because it was one of the few forms of entertainment that cost nothing and required nothing but willingness. Abigail went with Clara Hewitt and Louis Rays and Edmund Cross, the four of them walking up the main street in the cold with their breath steaming. Homer Vaughn did not come. She noticed when they left that he was still in the stable yard, doing something with a saddle by lantern light. She did not say anything about it, because it was not her place to say anything about it, and she understood by now that Homer Vaughn's choices about what he attended and did not attend were his own, and always made for reasons he had earned the right to. But she thought about him during the social, between the dancing and the cider and the conversation, in the way you think about someone when the thing you are enjoying would be more enjoyable if they were present. She left the social a little early, leaving Clara with a group of friends and telling her she had papers to grade, which was only partially untrue. She walked back down the street in the cold dark with the sound of the fiddle fading behind her, and she stopped at the fence of the stable yard. Homer Vaughn was sitting on a crate just inside the open stable door, polishing a bridle by lantern light. He looked up when she stopped at the fence. "How was it?" he said. "Good," she said. "There was a decent fiddle player. Mrs. Oakes organized it, and she ran it with terrifying efficiency." The corner of his mouth moved. "She always does." She rested her arms on the top fence rail and looked at him in the warm amber lantern light. He had his hat, of course, pulled down, the brim throwing a shadow across his eyes even indoors. "Why did you not come?" He considered the bridle. "Crowds," he said simply. "I do better at distances." It was the most honest thing he had said to her about himself. She recognized in terms of his inner life, and she treated it accordingly. She did not pursue it, did not push at it, did not try to argue him out of it or suggest he should do otherwise. "You missed decent cider," she said. "Clara made a batch last week," he said. "I had some." She laughed, and it surprised her, a genuine laugh. A free one, not the careful kind she had been producing for much of the past year. It surprised him, too. He looked up from the bridle and looked at her with an expression that she could not entirely read, but that had something in it she had not seen before, something that was paying very close attention. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "It is good, your laugh." She felt warmth all through her that had nothing to do with the borrowed heat from the stable. "Thank you," she said. She straightened up from the fence. "Good night, Homer." "Good night, Abigail," he said, and using her first name was new, and she felt it the whole way inside the boarding house and up the stairs to her room. She stood at her window and looked at the stable, and at the small warm light of the lantern through the open door for a while before she sat down at her desk and tried to work, with limited success, because her mind had decided it had better things to do. January was cold and brilliant, the kind of clear sky winter that the high desert does, and that makes you understand why people stayed in a place this demanding. The mountains were snow-capped, and the desert floor caught the light in the mornings like hammered silver. The school had resumed after the Christmas break, and Abigail had added a new element to the curriculum. A weekly reading hour in the afternoon where she read aloud to the whole room, not a primer, but real literature, real stories. She had started with Washington Irving and moved to Dickens, and the children listened with the focused attention of people who have discovered that a story, a real story, creates something inside you that is worth having. Word got around, the way everything did in Dusthaven, and on the third Thursday of January, Abigail looked up from reading the opening pages of A Tale of Two Cities and found 3 adults standing at the back of the classroom, Mrs. Ray's, Lewis's aunt, who spoke limited English and was learning, an elderly man named Abel Frost who she had seen on the porch of the general store, and Homer Vaughn, standing in the back with his arms crossed and his hat on and his eyes fixed on her with an attention that was full and unguarded, and that caused her to lose her place in the text for one brief beat before she found it again. He came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. He stood at the back and listened to Dickens, and then to Thoreau, and then her own favorite to Keats, which she read to the children with the conviction that poetry was not above anyone, and that beauty was not a luxury but a necessity, and she could see from the way some of them went still during the poems that she was right. After the reading hour, when the children had gone and Abigail was stacking her things, Homer stayed. He picked up a piece of chalk and turned it in his fingers in the quiet way he handled things he was thinking about. "Keats," he said. "You know him." He set the chalk down. "My mother read to us when I was a boy. Burns mostly, some Keats." He paused. I had not heard any of it in a very long time. She was looking at him across the empty classroom, in the thin winter afternoon light that came through the windows and lay in pale strips across the desks. There was something open in his face today, something that the combination of the poetry and the memory of his mother and the warmth of the room had produced, something that was not sadness exactly but was its relative. "Come on Saturday," she said. "To the library." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Dusthaven does not have a library." "I know," she said. "I intend to build one. I have been writing letters. I have had 34 books donated so far, from churches and schools in Santa Fe and Las Cruces." She watched his face. "I need help with the shelving." He was quiet for a moment. "What time on Saturday?" She smiled, and he watched the smile happen the way you watch something you did not expect and find yourself glad to have seen. February brought a thaw, relative and brief, and with it a development that shook Dusthaven more seriously than any weather had. The Rouse brothers were back, and this time they had come with a purpose. Abel Frost's dry goods store, which had expanded from the original general store, was robbed on a Wednesday night. The thieves came through the back, took the cash box and a considerable amount of goods, and were gone before first light. Sheriff Beale, who was a competent and honest man operating with limited resources in the way of frontier law enforcement, found their tracks heading north and came back to town looking grim and realistic. The town was shaken. Abel Frost was not a wealthy man, and the robbery had taken enough to genuinely hurt him. There was a meeting at the church that night, informal and tense, the kind of meeting that frontier towns hold when they are frightened and trying to figure out if they are also angry enough to do something about it. Homer Vaughn was at the meeting. He sat near the back, as he always sat in groups, but when Sheriff Beale had finished his assessment and opened the floor, Homer stood up and said, in his quiet, complete way, that he knew the country north of Dusthaven well enough to track effectively, that the Rouse brothers had a pattern of running north to a canyon system near the Rio Salado when they needed to wait out pursuit, and that if the sheriff wanted a scout, he was available. The room listened to this with the attentiveness that towns give to people they have trusted over time, and Sheriff Beale nodded and said he would take Homer up on it in the morning. Abigail, sitting 3 rows from the back, heard all of this and felt something specific, an involuntary tightening in her chest that she recognized as fear, the particular fear of caring about someone's safety. She had not known until that moment, not with this particular directness, exactly how much she had come to care. She found him after the meeting on the porch of the church in the cold night air. "You will be careful," she said. It came out more direct than she had intended, less dressed up. He looked at her with those still gray eyes, and something moved in them, something she had been watching build for months, something she had been waiting for without entirely admitting she was waiting. "I generally am," he said. "That is not a promise." "No," he said, "it is not." A pause. "Abigail." He said her name the way he said things he had decided, with finality. "I will come back." She held his gaze. "See that you do." He was gone 2 days, and they were 2 of the longer days Abigail had spent in recent memory, which told her things about herself that she was mostly already aware of. She taught school and helped Abel Frost draft a letter to the county seat requesting better law enforcement support. And she organized the first book delivery to the new lending library she had set up in a corner of the schoolhouse. And she graded papers and helped young Rose Morales with a reading passage that the girl was determined to get perfect. And she did all of these things with her full attention, because she was not a person who let her heart run away with her efficiency. But in the evenings, she sat on the front porch even though it was cold, and she looked at the dark stable next door, and she was honest with herself in the way she tried to be about everything. Homer Vaughn came back on the morning of the 3rd day, riding in just after dawn with Sheriff Beale and one of the town deputies. The Rouse brothers had been found in the canyon system exactly where Homer had predicted, and they were now in custody, the stolen goods mostly recovered, and bound for the circuit judge in Santa Fe. The operation had been conducted without violence, which Homer reported at the sheriff's office with the satisfaction of someone for whom avoiding violence was not weakness but preference. Abigail was on the porch when he rode in. She had been there for 20 minutes, since she had heard the horses approaching, telling herself she was simply taking the morning air. He saw her immediately. He dismounted and handed his horse's reins to the stable boy and walked to the porch, and there was something different about his face, not relaxed exactly, because Homer Vaughn never relaxed entirely but settled, present. "You are here early," he said. "I often take the morning air," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that full, quiet attention. "You were worried," he said. She lifted her chin slightly. "A little." He stepped up onto the porch, so that he was on the same level and closer than he usually stood, and he looked at her with an expression that had something in it that was not the usual controlled stillness but something warmer, something that was trying to find its way out. "That means something," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "I expect it does." They looked at each other in the early morning light, and she thought she had rarely seen anything as clear as his face in that moment, stripped back to something that was just Homer and nothing else. No distance, no habitual reserve, just the man standing there in the cold morning looking at her like she was the clearest thing he had seen in a very long time. "Abigail," he said. "Homer," she said. And then neither of them said anything for a moment, because some things do not require words to be understood, and they were both people who understood this. What she said next was practical, because she was a practical woman even when she was also a feeling one. "Come inside and eat. Clara has kept breakfast warm and you have been riding for 2 days. He came inside. He ate Clara's breakfast at the big kitchen table, while Abigail sat across from him with her own coffee, and Clara moved around the kitchen with the magnificent tactfulness of someone who understands when to be present and when to be furniture. And the morning was warm and good, and Homer Vaughn ate with the steady appetite of a man who has been cold and working, and he kept looking up at Abigail across the table with those gray eyes that had something new in them now, something that had opened like a window. Spring came to Dusthaven the way it always did in the high desert, not gradually but all at once, a sudden greening that appeared seemingly overnight and transformed the landscape into something that made you understand why people wrote poetry about this place. The cottonwood trees along the small creek at the edge of town put out their first yellow-green leaves, and the desert floor between the sage bushes began to show color, small purple and yellow flowers that had no names Abigail knew, but that she resolved to find out. She and Homer had settled into something that was understood between them, even though it had not been formally spoken. He walked her to the schoolhouse every morning, which had begun as a natural coincidence. His first errand of the morning was often to the farrier's at the north end of the street, which was past the schoolhouse, and had become, without any formal agreement, simply the thing that happened. They talked during these walks with the ease of people who have discovered that their minds fit together comfortably, finding the same things interesting, pushing back on each other when they disagreed, which happened more than you might expect for two people who were clearly drawing toward each other, and which was one of the things Abigail valued most about him. He did not agree with her to please her. He thought the lending library was essential and told her so plainly, but he thought she was spending too much of her own money on it and said that too. She told him the books were the point and the money was a secondary concern. He said that a person who spent their secondary concerns into nothing ended up with no primary concerns either. She thought about this for 2 blocks and then told him he was right, which surprised him, and she said, "You are frequently right, Homer. It is one of your more aggravating qualities." And he laughed a real laugh, not the infrastructure of one, but an actual laugh that she felt like a gift. She had been watching him laugh for months, trying to earn it, and when it came, it was worth every effort. The library had become a real institution by March. She had 73 books now, on shelves that Homer had built on 2 Saturday mornings and installed at the back of the schoolhouse, solid and well-made in the way everything he built was. The adults of Dusthaven came in the evenings and on Saturdays, and Abigail had written up a simple lending log, and the honor system worked because, in a small town, it generally does when people feel that someone has trusted them. Louis Reyes was there every Saturday without fail, and he had taken on the role of unofficial librarian with the systematic satisfaction of someone who likes things organized. Abel Frost, whose store had been restored to functionality with the recovery of most of his stolen goods and a town collection that had moved Abigail considerably, came to the library on a Thursday evening and spent 2 hours with a book on agricultural history, and told Abigail afterward that he had not read a book for pleasure since 1855, and thank you for reminding him that it was possible. In April, on a warm Sunday afternoon when the whole world seemed made of light, and the smell of the desert flowers was so present it was almost a sound, Homer Vaughn stopped in the middle of the road between the boarding house and the church, and turned to face Abigail with an expression that was as resolved and open and present as anything she had ever seen on a human face. "I have been trying to find the right time for this," he said, "and I have concluded that there is no right time and I should simply say it." She waited, very still, the warm light all around them. "I love you," he said. "I have been loving you since October or possibly earlier, and I am not a man who says things like that easily or lightly, which you know, so I want it understood that I mean it completely." She felt everything that was in her chest rise toward him like the desert in spring. "Homer," she said. "I am also aware," he said, "that you are a woman of independent mind and considerable capability who does not require anyone for the basic functioning of your life, and I am not suggesting that you do. I am suggesting that I would like to be allowed to love you and to see if you might, if there is any possibility." "Homer," she said again, and this time she took the 2 steps between them and put her hand against his chest, over his heart, which she could feel beating fast under her palm through the wool of his coat, which was immensely reassuring, that this composed and carefully maintained man had a heart that was racing. "I have been loving you since November," she said. "Possibly earlier." He put his hand over hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his chest, and he looked at her with the full weight of everything he was, undefended. "Then we have wasted some time," he said. "Not wasted," she said. "We were building up to it properly." He kissed her then, in the middle of the road between the boarding house and the church on a warm April Sunday, with the desert wind and the flower smell and the mountains in the distance. And it was the kind of kiss that is also a conversation, that says things about the person doing it. His was careful and deliberate and warm and entirely committed, and she felt it as a complete declaration. Clara Hewitt, watching from the front window of the boarding house with her arms folded, and her expression the precise neutral of a woman who had been expecting this for 4 months, permitted herself one small satisfied nod and went back to making bread. The summer of 1874 in Dusthaven was the best one Abigail had ever spent. She knew this without qualification, not even guiltily, because Thomas Keller had been the kind of man she described to Homer, a man who would have been glad for her, and she loved the memory of Thomas honestly and cleanly as the thing it had been, while the present life with Homer was a different and complete thing that required no comparison. They spent evenings on the porch together, reading or talking or simply watching the desert do its extravagant things with the light. He read to her sometimes in his quiet voice, from the Shakespeare she had not said anything about but had placed deliberately on the library shelf where he would find it. And he did find it and he did read it. And sitting with her coffee in the warm evening air listening to Homer Vaughn read Henry V in a voice that came from somewhere deep and genuine, was an experience that she understood was rare. He told her more about the war. Not systematically, not all at once, but in the way that trust works piece by piece. The small stories first, the larger ones later, each one a confidence offered and received. He told her about the smell of Virginia in June and the particular quality of exhaustion that was different from tiredness, bone-deep and permanent feeling. He told her about a horse he had ridden at Brandy Station, a gray stallion named Edmund, which made her laugh, that the horse had the same name as their boring boarding house companion, and that Edmund the horse had been the best cavalry horse he had ever known. He told her about the day he had received the news about his father and brother, a letter that came 3 weeks after the fact, and that he had folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket and kept writing because there was nothing else to do. She listened to all of it the way she had always listened to him, fully, without flinching, without rushing to the comfort that would have been for her benefit rather than his. One evening in July, she asked him something she had been carrying for months. They were inside, in the parlor of the boarding house, which Clara had given them use of in the evenings as a matter of course, a quiet privacy that everyone understood and nobody discussed. He was sitting in the armchair by the window and she was on the settee across from him, and the room was lit with the warm yellow of 2 oil lamps, and it was peaceful. "Homer," she said. She looked at him across the lamplight at the hat on his head, and she asked it simply with no preamble. "Would you take your hat off?" He was very still for a moment. The hat, always the hat indoors at every meal, in the heat of summer, in the cold of winter, always on his head. She had been curious about it for 9 months, and she had kept the question to herself because it was not urgent, and because she understood that people's quiet habits are often their armor, and she respected armor. But something had shifted tonight. Something in the air of the room, some quality of the lamplight or the peace of it, some sense that they were past the threshold of a thing together. She asked it without strategy, without significance, just as a natural extension of sitting across from a man she loved in the lamplit evening. He looked at her, and then, without any visible hesitation or deliberation, without pausing to decide, he reached up and removed the hat. He seemed, in the moment after, slightly surprised at himself. His hair without the hat was dark and somewhat disheveled, the curl that showed at the edges more pronounced now, free of the hat's pressure. There was a long scar along the left side of his hairline, thin and silvered with age, that disappeared into his hair. From the war, she understood without being told. Something that had been under the hat all this time, something he had been covering without making it a conversation. He sat with the hat in his hands and looked at her, and his face was entirely open in that way it sometimes was, entirely unguarded, and she thought she had never in her life seen anyone look so present and so young and so old simultaneously. "You asked," he said quietly, "and I did it without thinking." "I noticed," she said gently. "I have not done that in a very long time." He looked down at the hat in his hands with a kind of wondering expression, like he was examining evidence of something he had not expected. "I have been wearing it inside since," he stopped. "Since the war, since my first winter back. It became a habit, and then it became something else, something I held on to." He turned the hat slowly in his hands. "I do not know that I can explain it clearly." "You do not have to," she said. He looked up. "My father gave me this hat the autumn before I enlisted. He said a man needs a good hat more than almost anything, and he was right about most things." He paused. "Wearing it was the closest thing I had to him still being present." The room was very quiet. She could hear the small sounds of the house, the creak of the boards, the distant sound of someone in the kitchen. She crossed the room and sat on the arm of his chair, which was something she had not done before, a new proximity, and she put her hand on his where they held the hat and said nothing at all, just held his hands with the hat between them. He turned his hand and held hers back. "When you asked," he said, "just now I did not think. I just did it." He looked at her with those gray eyes that were very close now, that she had been looking into for 9 months and still found new things in. "That is what you have done to me, Abigail Keller." She felt the words go through her clean as light. "Good," she said softly. He put the hat on the side table and looked at his empty hands for a moment, and then he looked at her, and she kissed him this time, leaning down from the chair arm, her hand at his jaw, and it was soft and deliberate and complete. After that, Homer Vaughn did not always wear his hat indoors. Not every evening, not at supper, not in the lamplit parlor with Abigail. He still wore it outside, always. It was a working hat, and a memory of his father, and those things did not change. But in the specific spaces that belonged to the life he was building with her, he left it on the peg by the door and walked in bareheaded and lighter, like a man who has decided that the thing he was carrying can be set down now without being lost. Clara noticed and said nothing. Louis Reyes noticed and met Abigail's eyes across the supper table one evening with a quiet look of pure satisfaction that she returned with equal warmth. Edmund Cross either noticed or did not notice. It was genuinely impossible to tell. It was September 1874 when Homer Vaughn proposed marriage, and he did it in the most Homer Vaughn way possible, which is to say directly and without ceremony, and with complete seriousness. They were at the lending library on a Saturday afternoon, putting a new shipment of books onto the shelves. She was on the small step stool, reaching for the upper shelf, handing him books and calling out the titles while he placed them in the order she had determined. It was completely ordinary, the domestic quiet of two people who have learned each other thoroughly enough to work together without friction. He placed a copy of Thoreau's Walden on the shelf and turned to her and said, "Marry me." She looked down at him from the step stool. That was not a question. "No," he said, "it was not." She looked at him, at his face turned up toward her, entirely resolved and entirely wanting, the gray eyes steady, and the jaw set in that familiar way that she had come to understand as his version of laying everything on the table. "Yes," she said, obviously, and stepped down from the stool and into his arms. He held her with the same quality of attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. Complete, steady, enduring. She put her face against his neck and felt his arms around her, and thought that this was a very specific kind of happiness. The kind that is not about elevation but about presence, about being exactly where you are with the person you want to be there with. They were married in November 1874, in the small church in Dusthaven, by a traveling minister who came through twice a year, and who looked at Homer and Abigail with the benign recognition of a man who has married many couples, and can tell immediately which ones are serious. Clara Hewitt stood up for Abigail, and Louis Reyes stood up for Homer, which was a choice that said several things about Homer Vaughn that Abigail already knew and admired. That he had chosen his friend without reference to what anyone else in the town might think about the fact of a Mexican man standing at the front of the church in the role of closest companion. The Colburn boys, Jed and Randall, came to the ceremony without being asked, scrubbed and in their Sunday clothes, and sat in the second pew like they were guarding something. Little Rose Morales was there, in a white dress her mother had made, and she scattered dried desert flowers down the aisle with the intensity of someone taking a sacred responsibility very seriously. Abel Frost cried. Nobody mentioned it. Homer wore the hat to the church because he wore the hat outside always, and because it was his father's hat, and it was appropriate to have his father present at his wedding. But when he and Abigail walked back out of the church as married people into the brilliant November light, and later when they sat down together in the boarding house parlor for the celebration supper that Clara had prepared with the thoroughness of a woman who considers cooking a form of love, he took the hat off and hung it by the door, and sat with his wife in the lamplit room with his whole face visible and warm. And it meant more than any ceremony, because it was the choice he made every day now. They moved into a small house at the north edge of Dusthaven in December, a two-room adobe that Homer had been quietly buying and improving for 3 months, with the intention that is easier to have when you are certain about something. He had plastered the walls himself and built the furniture from good wood he had brought from Santa Fe, and the bookshelves along the east wall were already half filled, because Abigail brought her part of the lending library home in installments, which she was allowed to do because she had built the library, and everyone understood that some of the books were hers. The house was warm and clean and smelled of wood and plaster, and the cedar boughs she hung from the ceiling beams for Christmas. And in the evenings they sat by the fire that Homer built with the same care he gave to everything, and she read while he worked on whatever needed working, and sometimes he read aloud to her, and sometimes they simply sat in the particular piece of people who are exactly where they want to be. Spring 1875 brought the news that Abigail had suspected since February, and confirmed with a conversation with Dr. Halton, the circuit doctor who came through Dusthaven every 6 weeks. She was expecting a child. She told Homer at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning in March, with the spring light coming through the window and the smell of coffee and the desert beginning its sudden bloom outside. She watched his face carefully, ready for anything. What she saw was something she had not quite expected. He went very still, the way he did when something was large, and his eyes went to hers and stayed there for a long moment, and then something moved through his face that was almost geological, a whole interior landscape shifting, and he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. "Abigail," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "Doctor Halton says November." He held her hand between his and looked at their joined hands and then looked at her, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before, with something that was happiness pressed so hard it was almost pain. "A child," he said quietly to himself as much as to her. "Our child," she said. He got up from the table and came around to her and pulled her to her feet and held her carefully with that same complete attention, his face in her hair. She could feel him breathing. "My father would have been," he started and stopped. "He would have been very happy," she said, with the certainty of someone who has been told enough about a person to know them. He did not speak for a while. He just held her in the morning kitchen while the spring light moved. Clara Hewitt, who received the news at her own kitchen table over tea, put down her cup and took Abigail's hands in hers and looked at her with eyes that were brilliant with something warm and maternal that she rarely let show, and she said, "That is the best news in this town since the library." Louis Reyes bought a bottle of good wine from Santa Fe and brought it to the house on a Saturday evening, and the four of them, Homer and Abigail, Louis and Clara, sat around the table in the little adobe house and drank to new life and to Dusthaven and to the particular improbable grace of things working out. The summer of 1875 was gentle with Abigail, or as gentle as New Mexico summers got, and she taught school through June, and then handed the school to a young woman named Miriam Cole, who had arrived in June looking for the teaching position that Abigail had agreed to hold open. A woman she had written to and recruited from Santa Fe, sharp and energetic, and not yet 25, who Abigail had conducted an extensive correspondence with before agreeing to recommend her to the town council. Miriam Cole arrived and fit into Dusthaven with the ease of someone who belongs to frontier places, and Abigail spent a month teaching her the children, the school, and the library, and doing it with the confidence of someone passing something good forward, not giving up a thing but extending it. She spent the July and August in the house, in the comfortable way of a woman in her 7th and 8th months, who has decided that this is a time to be still and present. Homer came home in the middle of the day sometimes to check on her, which she noticed but never said he should not do, because she had stopped pretending she did not want the things she wanted. He read to her in the evenings, at her request, sitting in the chair near the window with the hat on its peg, and his voice moving through the words with that quiet authority, and she sat with her hands on her round middle and thought about the fullness of things. Their son was born on the first day of November 1875, in the adobe house with Clara Hewitt in attendance and Dr. Halton 10 minutes too late to do anything, but confirmed that both mother and child were doing well. He was a healthy, substantial boy who announced himself to the world at considerable volume, which Clara said was an excellent sign. Homer Vaughn, who had been in the kitchen for the last 3 hours in a state of controlled and insufficient calm that Clara had observed with warm amusement, came in when called and stood over the bed looking at his wife and his son with an expression that dismantled him entirely. All the composure, all the controlled stillness, every piece of carefully maintained reserve, gone, just a man looking at the most important thing in his life. Abigail, who was exhausted and radiant in the specific way of women who have done something enormous and know it, looked up at him and said, "Come and meet your son." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and she placed the baby in his arms and watched Homer Vaughn hold his boy for the first time with the hands that were always so still, and they were not still now. They were moving gentle, careful adjustments, the instinct of it. "What will we call him?" he said. "You choose," she said. "I have been choosing everything else." He looked at her with sudden brightness in those gray eyes. "James," he said, "for my father." "James Vaughn," she said. "That is a fine name." "James Thomas Vaughn," he said, looking at her with the question in it. She felt the warmth of it reach all the way through her. "James Thomas Vaughn," she agreed. James Thomas Vaughn slept in his father's arms for 20 minutes while Clara bustled in the kitchen making restorative broth and Homer sat on the edge of the bed not moving, barely breathing, with the baby against his chest and his eyes on Abigail and his face entirely at peace for the first time in perhaps a very long time. December of 1875, in the adobe house, was the warmest December Abigail had ever known. Warm from the fire, warm from the presence of the small person who had arrived and immediately become the center of all gravity in the house. Warm from Homer, who was a father the way she had somehow known he would be, attentive and patient and utterly genuine, without performance or awkwardness. She watched him with James in the evenings, the baby on his chest or in the crook of his arm, Homer's big quiet hand steady and sure, and she thought about the man she had seen outside the livery on her first day in Dusthaven, alone with his hat and his distance and his horizon, and she thought about the miles between that and this. She thought about the hat. It was on its peg by the door. It had been on its peg more often than not for a year now. He wore it outside, to the stable, to the town, because it was a working hat and his father's hat, and that would never change, and she was glad it would never change. But in the house, with her and James, it was on the peg. He had taken it off and not been diminished by it, and in fact something had grown instead, something that had needed the space the hat had been occupying. She was nursing James one evening in January 1876, the New Year clean and cold outside the window, when Homer came in from the stable and removed his hat and hung it on the peg in the seamless way of a habit settled into comfort, and sat across from her and watched his wife and his son with that full, still attention. "You are thinking something," she said. "I am often thinking things," he said. "You are thinking something worth saying." He considered this with the seriousness he gave to considerations. "I am thinking that this is the best of all the lives I could have had," he said. She looked at him over the top of James's dark-haired head. "You sound surprised." "I am, perhaps," he said. "A little." She shifted James, who had fallen asleep with the spectacular completeness of infants, and held him against her shoulder. "I am not surprised," she said. "I thought it would be good. You were more certain than I was." "I usually am," she said pleasantly. He laughed, the real laugh that she had worked so hard to earn in the early days and that came so freely now, and the sound of it filled the warm room, and James stirred slightly in her arms and settled again. Spring came. James was 4 months old and beginning to look at the world with an expression of concentrated investigation that was entirely his father's. Louis Rays came to Sunday suppers now, a tradition that had established itself organically over the winter. Louis and Clara and Homer and Abigail and the baby, at the big table in the adobe house, with the kind of food that happens when Clara Hewitt is present and takes the cooking seriously and will not be argued with about it. These Sunday suppers became one of the things Abigail loved most about her life. The laughter around the table, Louis's dry, precise wit, Clara's warmth under its practical surface, Homer's quiet contributions that landed perfectly because they were always worth waiting for. The baby passed from arm to arm as he got older and more sociable. The conversation that ranged from politics to local gossip to the books they were all reading from the library. The town had changed in the 2.5 years since Abigail had arrived. Not dramatically. Dusthaven was still Dusthaven, still dusty and frontier rough, and operating at the edge of the civilized world, but it had acquired certain qualities that it had lacked before. The lending library had made a difference that was hard to quantify but easy to see in the way people talked. Miriam Cole was a fine teacher and had added 2 new students to the school. Abel Frost's store had recovered and expanded. Louis Rays had been promoted at the assay office to head assayer, which was a justice that had taken too long, and that Homer had marked with the comment that it was about time, said to Louis directly with a warmth that was more than the words. Abigail had gone back to teaching in September 1876, when James was 10 months old and able to spend his mornings with Clara at the boarding house, which Clara had proposed with a firmness that brooked no refusal, and that was transparently one of the great kindnesses of Abigail's life. She went back to the schoolhouse with the relief of someone returning to a vocation that is genuinely a vocation, not just a job. Miriam Cole was delighted to have her back as a colleague, and they reorganized the curriculum together, dividing the children by level rather than age, and providing something closer to real instruction. The library had grown to 231 books by the end of 1876, and Abigail had submitted a proposal to the Territorial Education Board for a small grant to expand it, written in her clear and persuasive hand. And in the spring of 1877, the grant was approved. It was the first library grant ever awarded in Dusthaven, and when the letter came, Abigail read it at the kitchen table and then set it down carefully and pressed both hands flat on the table for a moment with her eyes closed, feeling the specific satisfaction of something built from nothing reaching a point where the wider world acknowledged it. Homer, who had come in from the stable and found her with her eyes closed and her hands flat on the table, said, "Good news or bad news?" with the slight edge of concern that James's arrival had produced in him, a new alertness to her moods and states. "The library grant," she said, opening her eyes. "It was approved." He looked at her face for a moment at the quiet triumph in it, and then he crossed the kitchen and put his hands over hers on the table. "That is well deserved," he said. "It is for Dusthaven," she said, "not just for me. Most things that are for Dusthaven are also at their root because of you," he said, with the plain honesty of someone who sees things clearly and names them clearly. And she held his hands and thought that this was what love was, partly being truly seen by someone, accurately over time, without revision. In the summer of 1877, James was learning to walk, which he did with the single-minded determination of someone who has identified a goal and will achieve it regardless of the number of times the floor rises up to meet him. Homer spent Saturday mornings on the kitchen floor with him, steady and patient, and Abigail sat at the table with her coffee watching the two of them and cataloging this in her memory with the deliberate intention of keeping it. Homer Vaughn on the kitchen floor, hat on the peg, dark hair loose, patient hands ready, and James Vaughn falling and getting up and falling and getting up with the magnificent stubbornness of the new. Autumn 1877 brought the news that Abigail was expecting again. She told Homer the same way as the first time at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, and his response was the same in structure, the stillness, the reaching for her hand, but with a quality this time that was different from the first, less geological shift and more the opening of something that had already been opened and was glad to be opened again. When he said, "April," she said, he looked at her with those gray eyes bright and quiet. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "Dr. Halton says everything is good." He raised her hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it, the gesture old-fashioned and entirely sincere, and she felt it everywhere. "James will have a brother or sister," he said. "He will," she said. "He has opinions about everything already. I imagine he will have opinions about this too." Homer smiled, the full warm smile that she had the immense luck of seeing every day now. "He is his mother's son," he said. The winter of 1877 and 1878 was long and cold, and deeply good in the way that winters are when you have a warm house, and a person who is glad to be in it with you, and a small boy who finds everything about snow to be a personal gift. James Vaughn encountered his first real snowfall in December of 1877 and stood on the front doorstep in his coat, and had a small version of Homer's hat that Homer had found at the dry goods store, and presented with a formality that made Abigail's heart crack open in the best possible way, and stared at the white desert with an expression of theological wonder. Homer stood behind him with his hand on the boy's shoulder, and Abigail stood in the doorway with the warmth of the house behind her, and she looked at the two of them, the man and the boy, and she thought about the morning she had ridden into Dusthaven with her carpetbag and her derringer and her quiet fury, and she thought about the man she had seen outside the livery with his hat pulled low and his eyes on a country that no longer existed. He had found his country. She was looking at it. Their daughter arrived in April 1878, exactly on schedule, with the same decisive announcement that James had made and that Dr. Halton, who was present this time and seemed satisfied with himself, declared to be a very healthy and very specific young woman who knew what she wanted. Homer held the baby girl in the way he had held James, with those impossibly gentle hands, with that full and unguarded attention, and he looked at Abigail over the small dark head with an expression that she had accumulated the vocabulary for over 4 years. It was love, the specific kind, the deep-water kind, the kind that does not move but holds everything. "A daughter," he said. "A daughter," she agreed. "What will we call her?" He remembered the protocol. "You choose," she said. He thought for a moment. "Marin," he said. "My mother's name." "Marin Vaughn," she said. "Yes." "Marin Abigail Vaughn," he said, looking at her. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "That is perfect," she said. Marin Abigail Vaughn was a person of strong opinions and considerable charm from approximately her first month of existence, and she wrapped her father around whatever she wanted with an ease that was somewhat spectacular to observe. Homer Vaughn, who had maintained a composed and deliberate exterior through wars and death and loneliness and years of carrying things that should not be carried alone, was entirely undone by his small daughter in the most complete and happy way. Abigail watched this with enormous satisfaction and only teased him about it occasionally. James, who was 2.5 and had the sovereign dignity of firstborn children, was initially uncertain about Marin but came to a rapid accommodation when it became clear that she looked at him with specific attention, as if she had arrived knowing he was important. He took this seriously. By the time Marin was 6 months old, James was her primary authority figure and protector, a role he performed with great seriousness and occasional bossiness that reminded everyone at the Sunday table of his mother. The Sunday suppers continued, a constant through the changing years. Louis Reyes brought, in the spring of 1878, a young woman named Catalina Vargas, whom he had been corresponding with for a year, a schoolteacher from Albuquerque whose intelligence and directness Abigail recognized immediately as belonging to the same family of qualities as her own, and who looked at Louis with the kind of attention that told you everything you needed to know. Abigail went home from that first Sunday supper and told Homer that Louis was going to get married, and Homer said that he had gathered as much from the way Louis kept accidentally smiling when he thought no one was looking, and Abigail said that was exactly what she meant, and they sat in the kitchen after the children were asleep with the last of the evening's warmth and talked about Louis and Catalina, and about their own beginning, which they had never quite stopped examining with the pleasure of people who still found it interesting. "You were sitting on the porch the first morning," he said, "with your papers. You were staring at the mountains. I was aware of you," he said. "From the moment you rode in," she raised an eyebrow, "you did not show it." "I was not ready to show it," he said, with the complete honesty she had come to expect from him, "but I was aware." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him across the table in the lamplight. The hat was on its peg, had been on its peg reliably every evening for going on 4 years. The scar along his hairline was visible, a small silver line, part of the landscape of his face that she had long since catalogued as simply his. Not a wound anymore, or not only a wound, just a part of him, like the gray eyes and the deliberate hands and the quiet that was not emptiness but depth. "Homer," she said. "When I asked you to take off your hat," she said, "that evening in the parlor," he looked at her steadily. "Yes. You said you did it without thinking, that was what I had done to you." "I did say that," he confirmed. "I have thought about that many times since." She traced a small circle on the table with her finger. "What you were holding onto with the hat, your father, the grief of it, all the years of it. You did not put it down because I asked. You put it down because you were ready, and you did not know it until I asked." He was quiet for a moment, with that quality of consideration she knew well. "Yes," he said, "I think that is right." "You had been carrying it until you had somewhere to put it down," she said. He looked at her with a completeness that was the most intimate thing she knew about him, the way Homer Vaughn looked at her when she had said the exact true thing. "Yes," he said simply. "You." She reached across the table and he met her hand in the middle, and they held on with the easy sureness of people who have held on long enough to know it is what they want to keep doing. Louis Reyes and Catalina Vargas married in September 1878, in the same church where Homer and Abigail had married 4 years earlier. Abigail stood up for Catalina, and Homer stood up for Louis, and James Vaughn, who was nearly 3, sat between Clara Hewitt and Marin's basket with the grave responsibility of someone who has been told his job is to hold the baby if she fusses, and he took this job with complete seriousness. Clara Hewitt, at 65, was the matriarch of everything and intended to remain so for a considerable time. She had taken to the role of surrogate grandmother to James and Marin with a warmth that was continuous and unsentimental, which was exactly the right kind. She arrived at the Vaughn house on Sunday mornings with food she had made because she had decided to make it, and she sat in the kitchen with the comfortable authority of someone who has earned her place and knows it. And she told James stories about the early days of New Mexico, the wagon trails and the cattle drives and the territorial politics, with the directness of someone who was there, and is not going to romanticize it, but will not dismiss it either. Abigail's library expanded into its own building in 1879, in the space between the schoolhouse and the church that had been an empty lot since a storage building burned down. The territorial grant had been renewed, and Abigail had written 2 more successful grant letters, and the town council had committed a portion of the annual budget to the library's upkeep. The new building was simple and solid, one room with good shelves on every wall and 3 reading tables in the middle and a wood stove in the corner. And on the day it opened, nearly every adult in Dusthaven came through the door. Homer built the shelves, of course, in the same way he had built all the previous ones, solid and true and made to last, and he installed them on 2 successive Saturdays with James at his side, the boy handing nails with the seriousness of an apprentice, and Marin in a basket in the corner, watching everything with her large, dark eyes. The day the library opened, Abigail stood at the door in the clear October light and shook hands with every person who came in, and she felt the weight of it. The years of correspondence and letters and persuasion, the books collected from donations and grants, the Saturday afternoons and Thursday evenings, the accumulation of small efforts into something that had become genuinely essential to the town. Homer stood just inside the door, and when there was a brief quiet between visitors, he stepped up beside her and looked out at the street, and he put his hand at the small of her back in the quiet way, and she leaned slightly against him. "This is good," he said. "What you have built." "What we have built," she said. "The shelves are half the library." He made a sound that was affectionate and dismissive of the credit at the same time. "Accept the credit, Homer," she said. "I accept the credit for the shelves," he said. "The rest is yours." By the end of 1879, Dusthaven was a different town than the one Abigail had ridden into on a dusty autumn afternoon 6 years earlier. It was bigger, more established, connected to the rail line that had come 20 miles south and brought with it the communication and commerce that changed frontier communities. The streets were not mud anymore, or not as often. There were 2 hotels and a proper restaurant and a barber shop and a dentist who came once a month. The school had 2 rooms now and 2 teachers. The library had 394 books and was adding to the collection regularly. The injustices had not disappeared with the progress. The land grant disputes were ongoing and dispossessing Mexican families of property they had worked for generations, and the law still bent depending on who stood in front of it, and Louis Reyes still had to be twice as competent and half as visible even after his decade in the territory. Abigail wrote letters about these things to the territorial government, carefully argued and precisely documented, and Homer, who had a thoroughness about justice that was not loud but was absolute, contributed information and contacts, and the occasional quiet word in the right ear. Progress was slow and often infuriating, but it moved. James Vaughn started school in September 1880, in Miriam Cole's classroom, with a book bag his mother had made and a hat, the small version of Homer's hat, replaced when it was outgrown with a new one in the same style, because James had decided this was the hat he wore and there was nothing to discuss. And the combined stubbornness and curiosity of both his parents assembled into a person who was becoming, everyone agreed, someone quite specific and remarkable. He came home from his first day and reported to Homer in precise detail on the contents of the day, including a disagreement with another boy about a mathematics problem in which James had been correct and had said so, which had not made him popular but had made him accurate. Homer listened to all of this at the kitchen table with the same complete attention he gave everything, and then he said, "Were you right?" "Yes," James said with certainty. "Then the accuracy is worth the unpopularity," Homer said. "But see if you can find a way to be right that is also kind. That is harder and more useful." Abigail, who was at the stove and had heard all of this, said nothing because it was the best thing she had ever heard said to a child, and anything she added would have diminished it. Marin turned 2 in April 1880, and the world was entirely her project. She was walking and talking with the same absolute determination she had shown in everything, and she followed Homer around the stable on Saturday mornings with the dedication of a shadow, and he lifted her up to pat the horses with an ease and a joy that Abigail could have watched for the rest of her life. The horses were calm with Marin in the way that good animals are calm with small people who have no fear, and Marin spoke to them in a continuous murmur that she considered to be conversation, and that they seemed to accept as such. In the evenings in the Vaughn house in Dusthaven in 1880, the world was contained and complete. The fire was warm and the lamp was lit, and the hat was on its peg by the door, and Homer Vaughn sat in his chair with Marin on his lap, while James read at the table with the focused absorption of a child who has discovered that reading is also a kind of solitude he enjoys. And Abigail moved between the kitchen and the main room with the easy authority of a woman in her own home, her own life, the one she built by coming through the right door at the right time and being honest about what she wanted. They were 33 and 39, Abigail and Homer, in 1880, and they were not young in the way of first starts, but they were not yet at the middle, and the distance ahead of them stretched out the way the desert did from the front porch on a clear morning, full of light and space and everything still possible. On an evening in late October 1880, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Homer and Abigail sat on the front porch in their coats with coffee, which was a thing they did when the evenings were cold enough for coats but not cold enough to stay in. The sky over the desert was extraordinary, as it often was, the kind of black that only exists far from cities, thick with stars, the Milky Way visible as a river of light. "I have been thinking," Homer said. "Tell me," she said. "The Ray's property on the North Pasture Road." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Lewis has been asking about expanding. The assay office is growing and he needs more space. There is land adjacent that could be his legally, and it is being disputed by an Anglo claimant with a thin argument and a friendly judge." "I know the case," she said. "I have been writing letters about it for 6 months. Senator Thornton's office in Santa Fe is more sympathetic than the territorial governor's," he said. "I have a contact there. I thought if your letter went through that office, you have been thinking about this too," she said. "For some time," he said. She looked at him in the starlight, this man, this particular arrangement of history and loss and integrity and love sitting beside her on the front porch in the cold night with his coffee and his careful attention and his hat on his head, because they were outside, because it was his father's hat, and it went on when he went out and came off when he came in, as regular and true as anything she had ever known. "Write me the contact," she said. "I will have the letter ready by Friday." "I know you will," he said. She took his free hand with both of hers and looked up at the stars, at the Milky Way running over the desert like a road to somewhere else, and she thought that all the roads she had ever taken, all the ones she had chosen, and the ones she had been pushed onto by circumstance and grief, had led here, to this front porch, to this man, to this cold October night with the stars and the coffee and the knowledge that tomorrow she would wake up and walk into a life she had built with both hands and her whole heart. "Homer," she said, "are you happy?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that she had long since understood meant he was giving the question its actual due rather than reaching for the quick and easy answer. The stars moved slowly overhead, the desert breathed its cold sage breath, and Homer Vaughn sat with her hand in his in the sky above him and thought about happiness with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he said, "I am." He turned to look at her, and in the starlight his face was open and certain. "More than I expected to be. More than I thought I had a right to." She squeezed his hand. "You had every right to it," she said. "You just had to get here." He looked at her for a long moment and then he said, quietly and completely, "I am glad you asked me to take my hat off." She laughed, the free and genuine laugh that had started one December evening across a stable fence and that had become, over 6 years, one of the foundational sounds of their life together. "It seemed like the right question," she said. "It was," he said. "It was exactly the right question." They sat on the porch in the cold October night until the coffee was gone and the stars had moved, and the coyotes began their distant conversation at the desert's edge, and the warm light of the house glowed behind them through the window, and the hat was on the peg inside, and everything that had needed to be put down had been put down, and everything that had needed to be held was held, and the life they had built together in Dusthaven, New Mexico, in the years after the war, was not a consolation and not a compromise but the full and complete thing, solid as the shelves Homer had built, and as stocked with good things as Abigail's library, and as much a home as either of them had known or made or loved, in all the years they had each been on their way to finding it.